he made a mistake, and consequently the switch went down, and we lost the whole data center. And the data center held a bunch of homegrown applications. We did all our order processing on a mainframe in those days. So the company went down. Basically, the company was offline for several hours.
Hello and welcome. Please come in. Join me. I'm Jonathan Crow, Director of Community at Ninja One, and this is IT Horror Stories. Brought to you by Ninja One, the leader in automated endpoint management. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to IT Horror Stories. I'm your host, Jonathan Crow, Director of Community at Ninja One. I have with me here Mark Settle. He's a 7-time CIO, including tours of duty at Okta, IHS, BMC. It's clear that we didn't settle for you, Mark. You are a top-tier guest. I'm so excited to have you. Also, the author of several books, including your latest, Truth from the Valley, a practical primer on future IT management trends. Obviously, a very timely topic. So many aspects of IT and really digital work in general being in an active state of flux. Thank you so much for taking time and being brave to join us here on the podcast.
I'm looking forward to it. This should be fun.
So before we get into your horror stories, let's talk a little bit about your background. Those 7 tours of duty, you as a CIO, major Fortune 500 companies. I mentioned that phrase because I was reading an article where you described, you compared military campaigns to IT, and you said everything that goes wrong in a military campaign is a near perfect mirroring of what goes wrong in IT initiatives. So I'm curious, when you look back at those 7 tours there, do you think about them in military terms where there was a successful campaign of operations, where there are moments where it was touch and go?
What that analogy refers to, so when either projects or just really routine day-to-day activities are disrupted in some way, the things that go wrong in battles, now this is historical battles. The technology today is so different, than the military sphere. But, historically, even during World War II, breakdowns in communication, just simple bad timing. There was some piece of information that if it had only been known 1 hour earlier, 2 hours earlier, would have been able to avoid, a certain kind of problem. Misallocation of resources, the wrong troops like in the wrong place at the wrong time. And again, just some defeats and some great victories are just so serendipitous because of the way resources were doled out. Just about every failed IT project, you can go back and tell yourself, gee, if I had just known we were falling this much behind schedule, or, if I had just gone in and asked for another 3 contractors, so I had like the resources to get the data transfer and get the schedule together. I mean, there's definite analogies for sure.
Oh, for sure. I imagine it's very easy to be an armchair, a Monday morning battle commander, right?
And that's the best way. Yeah.
It makes me think of another quote too, where it's, we don't rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. Best laid plans for leaders of any type, right? You can plan and have great strategy in place, but it's still got to come down to execution in the end. Did you ever find yourself kind of looking back and saying, oh, we've pinpointed, okay, here's what went wrong. We know how to be better prepared next time.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that question. Very early in my career, I worked for NASA, and I was involved in some early space shuttle missions. And we had one mission where we had this radar system that was in the shuttle. The shuttle was going to invert when it was on orbit and point the radar at the Earth and take various forms of data for different scientific research purposes. And there was a planning group based out of the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, and I worked with them. I wasn't responsible for this team. I was kind of like something of an informed spectator. And, this is well before the days of Scrum or whatever, but they had meetings every morning and every night at the end of the workday. And they were trying to plan like when to turn the radar on and how to tilt the shuttle and all this other kind of stuff. So the minute we got up on orbit, the whole thing got screwed up because there was a problem with the relay antenna to take the data from the radar system and get it down to the ground. And so it greatly constrained the position of the shuttle itself. There's only so many attitudes or orientations that we could put the shuttle into for the data. So basically, we took the whole data plan, threw it out the window, and then like in real time, orbit by orbit, like, okay, what do we do in the next orbit? What do we do in like, 2 orbits from now? That moment of realization was, the planning that you put into any project or activity is almost like more practice and like a mental thought exercise to try to grapple with all of the potential things that could happen or go wrong or how to react to, yeah, something that is unanticipated, in the course of that project or activity. And that was a real object lesson for me.
Looking back to that, like the types of leaders, types of military commanders or leaders of any type, would you describe yourself as on that spectrum of going into things with everything planned out, very by the book, procedures are ironed out, you've taken into account everything super detailed, or more on the side of the spectrum where you built things to be a little bit more adaptable on the fly? And I guess, have you had to occupy both of those roles in different ways at different points in your career?
Sure. I think, as you take on larger organizations, just like being a corps commander or an army commander, um, the battles are not fought at your level at all. I mean, the people that are actually doing it are a couple of tiers down. So you have to make sure you have good people. I think one thing you do learn is asking good questions. So you may not be, familiar with the peculiarities or the details of how we're going to get the data transferred from point A to point B, or the code testing we're going to do in 12 different environments, tire kicking that will run along the way. But my experience personally was, you develop enough intuition over time that you can ask good questions. And if people are open enough, they'll say, I've had people say, I don't know the answer to that, but I know I should know the answer to that. So I need to kind of go back and do like a little more homework. But the counterpoint to that is, earlier in your career, you are that person and you do the best job of coming up with the plan. And you have to be the one to know when to let go and kind of do a real-time replay.
Were there any times when you felt afraid or a little nervous about what you're kind of stepping into?
That's another good question. When I look back, I've told this to other people. I've done in some jobs where I've just thought, this is duck soup. I look around and I think that we're not doing this well. I know we need to change this. I can see what some of the systemic flaws are in the way the IT function is operating, where we have some talent deficiencies, et cetera. And then I've gone into other jobs where I've looked in the mirror after like 2 weeks. I think, why did they hire me? Like I don't have, and a lot of it has to do with the context, the business context of what you've gotten yourself into. You just kind of get into something and you go, wow, I don't really know anything about how this works. I thought, and I'll give you, examples, 1,000 words. I worked at Visa for 3 years, and when I took the job, I was younger and confident then, and I thought, how hard can this be? Okay, you just like authorize the transaction, and at night, the merchant banks and the member banks just settle up with each other. Like everybody gets paid and the money gets moved around, and then we start the whole new day with the transaction. And of course, it took me close to 2 years to figure out like what was really happening at the end of the day. It was far. And the other thing that job I would say frequently is like, how did they take something that's so simple and make this thing so complicated at the end of the day? But yeah, I've had both reactions to being overwhelmed and kind of underwhelmed at the same time.
Those 7 times being CIO, after the first couple, were there things that you started to look for or look out for? I mean, maybe there's red flags and there's green flags. Were there certain times in that where you were looking for, okay, I want to be able to go back into a place where I can run my playbook, versus maybe you were drawn to an opportunity where you're able to say, this is going to be completely new to me in some ways? What was going through your mind with some of those decisions?
So just to kind of pick up on the last answer, I think one of the important things, and other people would recommend this, is when you come into a new job, especially in like a Fortune 500 or 2000 company, it's really more important to get out and spend time initially with the business people and kind of understand the challenges that they're having, because your people will give you a warped impression of like what the problem is. It's like, well, we gave them this, but they're not using it properly. Or we tried to help them with this, but they made it more complicated and it would cost too much, so we didn't do it or whatever. So if you look at the IT function through the eyes of your customers, that's like one of the most healthy things you can possibly do. So I definitely recommend that. And then I think a lot of the direct reports that you inherit, what's the best way to put this? They're they're bought in, but they're not bought in, right? I mean, they're kind of waiting to see, okay, the CEO brought you in. Like, are you going to really influence the other executives? And are we going to get more money in headcount? Like, they really trust you. And so you're kind of in the back of their mind on trial. And each one of them will say, well, listen, I know more about the data center than Settle does. I know more about the applications here. I know more about the data warehouse or whatever. So I'm like completely comfortable in my little pig pen here, and like he can wander around and make prognostications of what we're going to do, et cetera, but I can fall back on this area of personal knowledge. So one of the things I have found to be very helpful is to try to get those people, your direct reports, out of their comfort zone. So an example would be, you'd say to the head of the data center operations, I want you to take a 90-day leave of absence and put together our budget for next year. And you're going to pitch it to the executive staff when we have the budget reviews that are coming up. And typical reaction is, oh, I don't know anything, that I'm not sure I want to do that. And I'd say, no, it'd be good. It'd be developmental, like you'd learn about the whole organization. And then they'd say, well, I think I could still do my current job and do that too. So I don't need to like really step out for the 90 days. And then I'd say, so you're telling me you haven't groomed anybody that can step in for 90 days and run your organization? Like that's, your absence of, career development for your direct reports. That's kind of a win-win. If they do a good job at the alternative assignment, it's more, it's a temporary thing. It's not a permanent change in their responsibilities. You get them out of their comfort zone. You get a better appreciation of what their real management or leadership skills really are. And you get exposure sometimes to some real talent within their organizations too, when those people start to show up. So I think it's important to get them out of the comfort zone. And in the best possible case, they come back, after the 90 days and they say, that is like the best thing that ever happened to me. Like I would have never gotten up in front of the CEO before. I would have never gone around and asked questions of all the C-level people to try to get their reactions to the budget before the big pitch meeting and all that kind of stuff. So yeah.
Let's get into a little bit more of that, and let's get into the horror stories that you wanted to discuss today, because I know at least one of these is related, and it falls on the people that you have to execute. You come in, you own the strategy, you're the new leader, you're there to guide, but in the end, the execution comes down to the people that you're delegating to. And I know for a lot of folks, they're very good technical individual contributors. They get identified as being good at their jobs. They get promoted. They get put into management. Delegation and letting go is a tricky thing for a lot of folks to be able to do. It's been hard for me to do. So I think the horror story, let's tee this one up. The first one that you wanted to talk about an employee that really highly skilled, and you've put them in a position to execute, and this hasn't necessarily gone to plan.
I think you're referring to a situation many years ago where I had a member of my data center team who had a very knowledgeable guy, and during a normal working day, I think it was a Thursday, he had gone in and done a software upgrade on the main network switch in the data center, and he made a mistake. And consequently, the switch went down and we lost the whole data center. And the data center held a bunch of homegrown applications. We did all our order processing on a mainframe in those days. So the company went down. Basically, the company was offline for several hours. So when the head of the data center team came to report this to me, I said, I'm not the most technically oriented guy in the world, but isn't this something that we don't do like on prime shift? Like, when we normally do this after hours? So he said, well, yeah, no, that's our standard operating procedure. He said, but this guy had a bar mitzvah to go to over the weekend. And so he thought he'd get this all out of the way on a Thursday. So he'd be free over the weekend to take care of this family obligation that he had. So it's also, I think, one of the telling points of that story is when we talk about human error, I think we frequently just assume, oh, it must be a junior person that just doesn't know the right thing to do, that they weren't properly trained, they didn't have the right checklist or whatever. And in fact, in my experience, it's really the opposite is the case. It's some of, your most highly skilled and usually like your most overworked people that inadvertently just cut a corner or have a little, momentary memory lapse or something. They are so remorseful. I mean, they take such pride in their work that they almost don't want to come to work the next day because they know the whole grapevine is going to, do you know what Jonathan did yesterday? Do you know that Jonathan touched the switch, hide under your desk, type of thing. So that's,
yeah, I mean, a sign of taking things seriously. I mean, I think you mentioned this person even went as far as to maybe even offer the resignation or suggest that.
yes, I've had that in a couple of instances where, or I think in this particular case, this individual suggested that he forfeit his bonus for the year.
Wow.
That he felt that badly. There was another instance, basically the same kind of thing. There was another individual, different company was using Jam as a tool to, manage a lot of the Apple devices that were out there. And again, he put in a software update that just happened to corrupt all of the working devices for the software engineers in the company. So they lost 2 or 3 hours of work, like through the whole company. They were just down like, oh. And again, he wanted to, he offered his resignation the next morning. He came in and just felt mortified.
It just makes you more relatable because who among us has not made a mistake? But I mean, thinking about this issue and what the what the postmortem is, what the corrections are. There's people, there's processes, there's tools. You had the standard operating procedure in place. That was right. It just wasn't followed. You have someone who is clearly mortified and clearly repentant about it. But what was your reaction? Do you remember? Because I mean, you have, this member of a team that you need. It's a high performing individual. You want them to continue to be high performing, right? You also have other members of the team who are watching now too and seeing, what's going to happen. He broke the rules for a reason. It seems like a difficult thing to navigate as a leader.
Yes, exactly right. Because you can't kind of write it off and say, oh, you get one pass. Like, we preach accountability, but you've clearly done something that had a severe business impact. But we're just going to overlook it this time because we know how smart you are or how hard you work, whatever. So you need some kind of I don't know if demonstrable is a good word, some form of punishment that is recognized as such by the other members in the group. So, in those 2 instances, the punishment that I devised was to tell them to go home for a week and not come in and think about, the jeopardy they had put the company into, and to come back and don't ever do that like again. And I don't know how effective that would be, in modern times. People would say, wait a minute, if I screw up, I get a week off and, all sins will be forgiven. But, in those 2 specific instances, those individuals needed like a little cooling off period too, I think, to kind of reflect. And, in some ways it was an easy pass for them. I mean, eventually they had to face their coworkers who all knew what had happened, but at least they had a week to kind of get some perspective, like they could handle it better instead of having to come in.
I mean, talking about another, facing fears, coming back to work and doing that after some time must take. Obviously overcoming that fear too. With these cases, do you recall were they able to come back and be solid contributors again?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Totally professional. Absolutely. They recognized that it was just kind of a momentary lapse. Well, I just remember the conversation specifically with the case of the Jamf person. I think his boss, he was 2 or 3 levels away from me. So the boss came in, like, we're talking about, what are we going to do? And the boss says, I don't think we could find another guy that knows this much about Jamf. Like, if he goes, like, it's going to be harder on us than it's going to be. He can go out and find a job tomorrow morning because he's got this high level of expertise, right? But we're going to be stuck here, kind of sucking wind, trying to find a replacement. So. I don't want to claim that was the justification or reason for the final punishment,
Sure.
necessarily, but yeah, they were totally professional. Neither one had any kind of a long-term negative reaction, whatsoever.
What's interesting to me is the comment that you made earlier on about, a lot of people think about the junior folks making mistakes. It's because of lack of knowledge, lack of training. Um, but in your instance, and these are great examples, right? That it's highly skilled people. Um, you're building your team. These are some of your top assets.
Yeah.
And here they are. They've brought down the company. They can sometimes do the most damage. They're the most skilled and the most, they have the most capability. And that can obviously be used for good, or when it's a mistake, it can really impact things. So did that change the way that you've operated with higher skilled level people? Do you put more checks in places in some cases, or anything that made you kind of change your approach there?
Well, funny you mentioned that you asked that question because we don't talk about it as much anymore. But there used to be a lot of reference to the hero culture in IT. You know, the, there's I think Steve Jobs said it's more fun to be a pirate than to be a member of the Navy, right? So, so in IT, it's like just I want to be known as the gunslinger. When things go wrong in a data center, I will wade in and I'll get that thing fixed, right? I mean, process, what process? Like I know everything like the back of my hand. Um, and if you look at the whole, oh my Lord, decades of investment of IT professional horsepower into so-called IT service management practices, idle practices that have been out there for a long time. It's all about building more of a process-driven kind of an organization. I mean, even in the Jamf case, the process would have been to do some testing of the upgrade on a very small subset of Apple machines before we rolled it out to the whole community. That would have been like standard procedure. For whatever reason, that individual thought there was more good to, it either was overkill to do the testing or was going to take too much time or, it just wasn't needed or he had too many other things to do. This was just going to allow him to check the box and move on to his next task. So, yeah, but yeah, so I think what you learn is to like go back and double down on process. And I've written a little bit about this too. Process is really hard. Because if you're not careful, you've either over-engineered or under-engineered the thing. You've either, made it so bureaucratic and convoluted that people just blow it off and don't even follow it, or it's so primitive that it just can't comprehend some of the situations that you get yourself into. So it's like, and very few organizations are really good at, constantly kind of refining, modifying, updating processes. I've seen some of the best work around project management, getting approval to start projects. Do we really need to take a project that's going to take 6 man-months and subject that to 12 documents and 5 levels of sign-off, 3 financial analyses and stuff like that. So,
This thinking back to the heroes, right? I think about the Phoenix Project, that book. And I think there was definitely the one engineer there. I believe his name was Brent. And it's funny because he was obviously so much was revolving around him, and it was so much was riding on him and on his shoulders. And but the second it just creates this kind of a brittle system with all this potential for horror stories. Where's Brent? What happened to Brent? Brent was sleep deprived. Brent made a mistake, and now it's all gone down, and nothing's been documented. No one can repeat what he's done. So, it definitely resonates and makes sense that the antidote to that is process.
you can overdo it as well. You can overkill the thing to the point where people just are really not even following the process. Like it exists. You can go find the documents. Maybe people were trained or whatever. I go back to the project management situation or scenario where sometimes, the whole justification process, planning process and whatever just gets over-engineered for 2 things. One, the amount of work that really is required or the risk exposure of, if you screw it up, what's the real business impact? It's going to cost a little more money. It's going to slip in time or whatever. Yeah. But if you have this big standard, 12-step process or 25-step process you put people through, then they just don't even come in. They just go do it on their own. So we're not going to, we'll never tell you.
Is there something with as a leader, wanting to ride that line between, having your people who are able to follow the checklist, follow the process,
Yep.
versus going back to the very beginning of our conversation? Another one of the horror stories that you mentioned wanting to tell was talking about making that point that, a lot of success ends up being serendipitous, and then a lot of the failures comes from things that, okay, yes, you know them in hindsight, but at the time, I mean, you were doing everything right. It was unexpected. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. And so training or enabling people to develop the skill of being resilient, being able to adjust and adapt on the fly. In one way, those two things kind of seem at odds, but is there anything in your experience that you've, have you been able to operationalize that a little bit, or is there a way that you kind of try to instill that ability in your teams?
It's interesting. If you look at the security area, the risk is so great in security that you do that. Like you have red teaming exercises, you hire people that basically try to pretend to be the bad guys and test your team and your technology and your processes, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess I could argue, like if you look at your application support team, and they're maintaining Workday and NetSuite and ServiceNow, Salesforce, et cetera, there's less of that kind of wargaming kind of an exercise that would go on. And I guess maybe that's just because implicitly the risk is less. You can take corrective action. You don't wake up and find, geez, in the last 2 hours, they just activated this thing that's been sitting in the network for 2 years. They pulled off all the employee records. So yeah, so that does go on in certain parts of the company. And to a degree, like if you're still running a data center, there's definitely some, constant testing and just risk prevention procedures that are followed all the time.
What about when things do go wrong? You were the one who had to deliver that bad news. This is what this podcast is all about. Let's revisit that painful moment for you, Mark.
So that one was an interesting one because it was sort of a comedy of errors. So I'm not going to take the time here to go through the whole process, but it just turned out that like we had a very small application that was not performing correctly. There were people that would normally have been in like the flow of this work process. Turned out one of them was on vacation, and the stand-in just wasn't that familiar with how the process was supposed to work. So to her, it looked like it was working fine, and it was just a concatenation of errors. If the viewers of this podcast or the listeners take away one thing, like just one thing, here's the deal. Bad news never gets better with time. So the minute because if you go up there, so let's say in this particular case, well, give me like 24 hours to really dissect this thing and figure out like what went wrong. Because when I go up there and have to tell him like we have 600 impacted customers, that's going to be that's not a good idea at all. Like you go up there, right? The first opportunity you have where this information, you can always say, I'll come back. Like I'll come back, like I'm researching it or whatever. I just want you to know, like we got 600 unhappy customers, right? And we're trying to identify them right now. In that particular case, I think we did some kind of a partial mea culpa. I don't know if we gave them something free or, whatever, but like we acknowledged we had a screw up, and then we told them we were going to do something for them in partial compensation. And they were like, it's an order problem. And so we immediately, prioritized their orders. But yeah, bad news doesn't get better with time. You better to immediately go up the chain of command and it's not, it'll only blow up in your face if you take longer time to tell somebody something bad.
Rip that Band-Aid off.
Yep.
Well, let's shift gears to some of the things now. You've written some fantastic books looking ahead to the future and looking at the current trends in IT management, looking at how things are evolving, really what the next stage of IT leaders, what they're going to need. You're doing a ton of advising. What are some of the things that you see IT leaders out there being very worried about or concerned about? What's keeping them up at night?
Well, it's not hard to figure out. If you look at there's these annual surveys that are done by like the Deloitte's Bains of the world every year where they ask people, like, what are your spending priorities for your IT budget? And historically, I say historically, the last probably 5 or more years, cybersecurity and data analytics have both, been consistently, at the top. And I think in both of those areas, people have purchased a lot of tools. They have a pretty complex tech stack. They feel like they're overbought or over-engineered. They're not getting, the value for the collective investment that they've made in that stack. And they don't really know how to unwind it. And they're being barraged by new startup vendors or new people that come in and say, I've got the missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Like you put most of the puzzle together. I have found the blue piece that goes in the sky, but you have not been able to, close the puzzle with.
We have a
So
whole new
that's-
puzzle now. It's holographic and it's got AI involved. So
Well, that's, so actually in the more recent surveys, the budget surveys going to 2025, Gen AI spending actually topped cybersecurity for the first time. But I don't know how to interpret that because, of course, a lot of the vendors in the cyberspace and the data space are all offering up AI-enabled products as well. So I don't think people would answer those questions, whether the questions are parsed, effectively to figure that out. But yeah, obviously that's sort of the big challenge of where and how to use AI. And it's, there's a couple of problems there. So one is all of your existing vendors are pushing some form of AI-enabled enhancement or, new capability at you. Then there's a new set of vendors who are saying, well, forget about that. Like we're AI native. Like we're not ServiceNow building, they've had a IT service desk solution for 20 years, like in their big and cumbersome and expensive and hard to learn and hard to maintain and take specialized expertise, et cetera. We're AI native. It's like we're tackling the same problem, but we're not encumbered with, all that legacy thinking and traditional way of tackling the problem. So you've got the legacy guys, you've got the new kind of startups that are going on. And in many companies, especially like in the financial service area, you're building your own applications or agents to do things for security reasons in part. So that's one class of problems. I think the other class of problems that I worry about, which I haven't really seen discussed so widely in the tech press, is AI explainability. Here's the way I look at it. Almost all the applications that we built in the past follow a certain set of rules or procedures, and you put data in, and they have like outcomes. And even if it's like a machine learning model, the model has been set up in such a way that for these inputs, there's some kind of a forecast or prediction that has a probability associated with it or whatever. The LLMs don't work like that. They evolve over time based upon the prompts they've received, what they've been asked to do, new training material that they're given, et cetera. So they pose really more of an ongoing testing problem. So they'll, this because you've read about it or experienced it. You don't always get the same answer to the same question, like when you come back. And why you got that answer instead of the other one, or you and I ask the same question and you get one answer, then I get another answer. So I think AI explainability, and to some people, I think that has the connotation of, oh, these models are discriminatory in nature, like they're biased in the way that they treat certain people, certain languages or certain genders or whatever. That's a concern. I understand those concerns. I just mean like explainability in business. Like you and I both submit an insurance claim and one LLM says, give Settle like $5,000 and they say, give Jonathan like $50,000, but it was the same thing. Why did that happen? And there's a lot of evidence of this. This is not just me dreaming this up. There are definitely instances where this is going on. So I don't think too many groups are structured today, nor do we really have formal rules for that kind of ongoing, deep analysis of why the models are producing the answers that they are.
Well, it seems to me too that there's an expectation of the ownership of this ultimately will fall to IT teams. Right? It's something that all of a sudden now IT teams are having to manage, and when users are having mixed results or things, the IT team is expected to be able to help with this. It just seems like for IT teams in particular, I know that there's anytime there's new waves of new technology and excitement around it and hype around it, buzz, there's all those factors of like, okay, but we're the ones who end up having to actually roll this out, manage it, try to audit it, monitor it, all that. There's a lot more work than the auto-magically results that come in.
Yeah, auto-magically. But the one thing that's different this time around is that I think even big companies and small companies, I think have generally formed some kind of a AI executive steering group, at the top of the company. So it isn't necessarily IT just holding the bag. And those executive governance boards or steering groups or whatever have tried to establish some kind of constitutional convention or rules of engagement, like you've got to come back through necessarily them, but some group that they've enshrined to make sure that, anything that you're taking off the internet is not using DeepSeek, because we're going to say that's verboten. That won't happen. So that's encouraging. You think back with the use of cloud computing resources, there was no executive steering group about how we're going to use AWS and what workloads we can take up onto AWS and whatever. That was left to IT to hammer out workload by workload with the different functional departments and the apps that they were using. So there is that level of governance, but you kind of go back to the unpredictability of the technology, and different people will be held responsible. I don't think it's going to be like all IT at the end of the day, and in fact, maybe there'll be some new kind of organizational entities that are set up to actually do nothing but that.
Mark, any other parting words to IT leaders out there who may be newer in their career, who are facing some challenges, all the potential changes coming up? You've had such great experience, such a great career, and you give advice all the time. Any parting words of wisdom for these folks?
I think on the topic that we spent our time on today is really try to, this sounds trite, but it's true, try to turn your organization into a learning organization. And so when things go wrong, don't just cover it up, oh my God, okay, I won't tell anybody if you don't tell anybody. So you take the data center example, let's all learn that, there's a certain level of process. So even if you're not involved in the data center operations, you're over on the data warehouse, or you're running the support team for the Salesforce app platform. Can you look in the mirror and say, well, that would never happen to us because we did for you. You might want to go back and look at how we're adding objects to that platform, or some of the new APIs we're opening up. Are we doing the right testing and everything? So I think you want to, you want to learn from the things that go wrong for the benefit of the whole organization, and not just kind of try to cover everything up and pretend that everything's perfect all the time. And I'll tell you the other thing is, your customers outside of the IT organization will respect you for doing that. Yeah, I think if maybe kind of post-warnings or problem management processes that you have, the more transparent you are, you will be respected. You learn from it internally, and then you'll be respected by your customers.
No covering things up, no hiding.
No hiding. Nowhere to hide. There is nowhere to hide in IT. That's true.
Mark Settle, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Again, your latest book, Truth from the Valley, Practical Primer on Future IT Management Trends. I'm excited to check it out. I know our listeners will be too. And Mark, just very much appreciate you spending time with us. Thank
you, Jonathan. Appreciate it. I thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to share some stories.
And thank you everyone for listening in, and we'll be back soon with another episode of IT Horror Stories. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of IT Horror Stories. For even more information and resources on how you can beat IT misery and transform your IT, check out ninja1.com or pop by our IT Leadership Lab community at theitleadershiplab.com. There you can connect with other IT leaders, talk shop, and get access to the latest guides, templates, and documents from other experts in the space. Remember, whatever your IT horror story, just know you don't have to go it alone. That's all for this week. We'll be back with more soon. Thanks for listening.